The year is 1948. At a party, April stands alone in the bar, looking ravishing. Frank Wheeler is at the same party talking to his friends when his eyes land on hers. Their first ever conversation is the flirtations their eyes did before their lips took over. They find a quiet corner to talk to. April is studying to be an actress. Frank tells her he is a longshoreman, but soon will be indulging in a more glamorous life as a night cashier at a cafeteria. April can't help but laugh. She asks him what interests him. In his witty way, he answers that if he had an answer to this question, he would have bored them both in half an hour. They instantly click and soon take the dance floor. They dance around the room, lost in each other, oblivious of the people around them. That day they fell in love. Back to the present, Frank comes back from this memory after he got lost in thoughts, while watching a play where April is performing. Someone in the audience didn't like the play and voiced her disappointment, especially at April's performance. The actors take a bow as the curtain falls, and the auditorium fills with the sound of applause. All the actors move backstage, but April stands behind the curtain for a little too long, wiping her tears. Frank is making his way backstage when Mrs. Giving stops him to congratulate him for April's performance. In the green room, April sobs sitting in front of the mirror. Frank is looking for April when Millie spots him and calls out to him. Millie tells her where April is and reminds him of their dinner plans together that evening. Frank makes his way inside the room. He calls out to her, and she comes out red-eyed from sobbing. But Frank doesn't notice that she has been crying. She asks him to wait for a minute till she takes her makeup off. Frank walks close to her and puts his arm around her shoulder. She expects he will say something to comfort her, but he makes a discourteous remark saying the play was not a success. April's hopeful expression suddenly turns downhearted. As she removes her makeup, she asks Frank to come up with a story to excuse themselves from going out with their friends Millie and Shep. After tonight's play, April is not in the mood to go anywhere else than her home. But Frank tells her that he met Millie outside just a few minutes ago, and has already given the confirmation that they will be joining them. Hearing this makes April irritated, and she asks if he minds going out again and saying he was mistaken. Frank thinks it will be rude of them to do so. April's mood is already sour, and she doesn't want to get into an argument with Frank, so she offers to say it herself. Frank asks her to calm down and says he'll talk to their friends. Teary-eyed, April watches him go out of the room. For the rest of the evening, they don't talk. On the drive back home, Frank finally tries to make a conversation. He praises her that she was the only one who was good in the play among a bunch of amateurs. April asks him to stop talking as the play didn't go quite as planned, and she knew it. But Frank keeps blabbering till April asks him one more time, sternly, to stop talking about it before it drives her crazy. Frank pulls up the car on the side of the road. He then turns off the engine and sits facing her. He then very politely asks her to talk about it. He gently strokes her hair and moves closer to her, but April doesn't want him to touch her. Having enough of him, she shouts at him to leave her alone. Frank is enraged but bites his lip to stop himself from saying anything foul. For a few seconds, he says nothing, but then he turns towards her and asks to get some things straight. First, it is not his fault that the play was lousy. Second, it is certainly not his fault that she couldn't become an actress, and he advises her the sooner she gets over the little part she played in a soap opera, the better it will be for them. And third, he won't be that man who fits into the role of dumb, insensitive suburban husband, as April has been trying to make him ever since they moved there. Before he could start on number 4, April had had enough. She gets out of the car and starts walking while Frank keeps shouting her name frantically. Frank gets out of the car to coax April to come back in the car, instead of fighting in the middle of the road. April is getting anxious. To calm her nerves, she lights a butt, but it doesn't seem to work. A very frustrated Frank complains that he has been trying to be nice about her play and how things turned out to be, but April is making things difficult. In a heavily sarcastic tone, April retorts it is terribly kind of Frank to handle things the way he does. They get into a verbal altercation, and end up calling each other names like sick and disgusting. Their wrangle increases to the point where Frank raises his fist and hits the head of the car multiple times. In the process, he hurts himself and shouts while clenching his hurt hand with the other. April gives him a woeful look, and Frank asks her not to look at him like that. After their catharsis, April asks Frank to take her home. They sit in the car in silence, no one trying to look at the other. What has their relationship come to? What started with sparks of passion has now turned into a flame of contempt. Frank is leaving for work. Once near his car, he looks back at his home before getting in the car and driving off. While April stands a few meters away from the window, looking at Frank as he leaves. Both realize how strained their relationship has become. Even as Frank makes his way to his work, amidst a sea of men wearing dull colors and surrounded by bland colors, they are a representation of how mundane his life has become. That morning while going up the lift, he finds one of his coworkers, Maureen, looking at him. When he turns towards her, she passes him a smile, and soon they reach their floor. It is probably the only joy he finds in his monotonous life. April is taking out the trash. She pulls the 2 large trash cans along the road, and we are taken into a flashback to when Frank and April first came into the neighborhood looking for a house. They had been married and were expecting their first child. Now that their family was growing, they needed a bigger place. Mrs. Givings is a small, garrulous lady. She recounts all the names of the neighboring streets and gives a detailed account of who lives where. She then takes them to the house they finally chose to make their home, a beautiful, white welcoming house standing on a slope. April is instantly galvanized by the house. Back into the present, April is still waiting for the garbage truck outside her home. At the office, Frank is called by his boss. He is angry at Frank, as the brochure he had sent for the conference at Knox came from Toledo, stating it is inefficient. It is the third time it has been returned this month. Frank apologizes and promises to take care of it. Back at his desk, he explains what happened to his colleague, Jack. He is stressing over the work when he sees Maureen walk by. He goes to her desk on the pretext of assigning her work and asks if she will be taking an early lunch. After the morning incident, Frank decided to make his move on her. The new spark is exciting for him, and he doesn't want to miss the opportunity to have a little fun. Maureen and Frank are having lunch together. To impress her, Frank calls the office and makes up an excuse to make Maureen stay with him for the rest of the afternoon. Maureen is impressed with Frank's wit and boldness. April is picking up the laundry. The couch is still messed up, as Frank slept on it the last night after the fight. She starts straightening the pillow when Mrs. Helen Giving calls April from the front door. April is happy to see Helen and asks her to come inside. Helen has brought sedum plantings for her to plant on the messy patch down by the foot of the driveway. She then tells April that the plantings are like European house leek, but these have gorgeous little yellow blossoms. Helen explains that these plants will need a tiny dollop of water once planted, and they'll thrive. April thanks her for the plants and invites her for coffee. Anticipating that Helen wants something from her, April asks her what she can do for her. Helen tells April her son, John, has been in the psychiatric hospital. John finds Helen's friends conventional, and so Helen wants April and Frank to meet John, so he can feel at ease meeting someone his age. April agrees and says they would love to meet him. Helen is surprised that it didn't take much persuasion, but then genuinely thanks April. She then hugs April and leaves. April stands at the door for a long time. Maureen feels a bit drunk after they've had some drinks together. Frank tells Maureen today is his birthday, and he turned 30. Maureen wishes him a happy birthday and raises a toast for him. Frank tells her his dad also worked for Knox. Once a year, his dad would take him to lunch in the city. It was supposed to be a very special, life advice sort of occasion. Frank used to sit there and pray he doesn't end up like his dad. He then laughs at the irony of the situation. Here he is, a 30-year-old Knox man. Maureen is too drunk to keep track of what Frank just shared, so Frank suggests they get some air. Back home, April opens a box with their photographs. She looks at the happy moments they had captured, with each other, with their child. One particular picture of Frank and his friend Shep takes her back to the day she saw it for the first time, and asks Frank about his trip to Paris. Frank loved Paris and promised to take April with him the first chance he got. He talked about his ambitions, and April could see how much it meant for him. For her, he was the most interesting person she had ever met. Back in the present, Frank is putting his clothes back on. An afternoon of adultery doesn't make him feel any remorse. He simply bids farewell to Maureen and goes back home like nothing happened. After pulling into his driveway, Frank sits there for some time, taking deep breaths. As he rings the doorbell, a very dressed-up April opens the door. Frank asks her why she is dressed up, but she takes him in her embrace and says she missed him all day. She apologizes for the way she has been acting since the play, and asks him to wait at the doorstep. She then closes the door and switches off all the lights. After a few moments, she calls him in. Frank makes his way in the darkness. As soon as he enters the dining area, April and his two children start singing him a birthday song. They baked a cake for him. They all wish him, and he cannot stop his eyes from getting moist. Seeing his whole family wishing him the best makes him overwhelmed. Now the guilt of what he has done starts creeping in. Frank keeps breathing heavily, but the feeling of unease doesn't go away. After the kids go to sleep, Frank asks April what this is all about. April tells him she has been thinking all day, calculating their savings. She suggests they move to Paris, since that was the only place Frank ever wanted to go back to and was worth living. They have enough savings that they can live off it for 6 months without earning a dime. Above that, if they sell their house and car, they will have more to settle down and start a new life in Paris. Frank asks April to calm down and asks her what he is going to do there. April says he'll do what he left 7 years ago, finding what he actually wants to do. He will finally have time and freedom to start doing it. Frank thinks hard about it but still ends up saying it is a very unrealistic idea. April tries to convince him by saying their present is unrealistic, because a man with a fine mind is working year after year at a job he can't stand, coming to a home that he can't stand, and a wife who's equally unable to stand the same things. The most frightening part of all this is that they think they are special and superior to anybody in the neighborhood. There is nothing superior about having a house in the suburbs, having kids, doing laundry, and living a life they despise. April stresses on the fact that they are not special. They are like everybody else. They bought into the same absurd idea that one has to resign from life and settle down the moment they have children. And April and Frank have been punishing each other for it. but Frank still thinks it is a big decision. He tries to talk April out of it and argues that nobody forced him to work at the Knox, and nobody said he was meant to be a big deal. April thinks otherwise. She reminds him when she first met him there was nothing he couldn't do or be. Frank is still not sure about himself. As appealing as the idea of having time for himself sounds, he thinks it would have been better if he had a talent. April interrupts him, saying it is Frank who is being denied the opportunity of becoming what he is. Frank asks her what he is, and April cups his face, looks him in the eye, and says he is the most beautiful and wonderful thing in the world. He is a man. A big smile envelops Frank's face, and he says yes to the plan. The next day, Frank's whole demeanor changes. He goes to the office in a very good mood. He whistles to himself as he walks into the office. His colleagues ask him why he is so happy, and he tells them he is moving to Paris. They think he is joking, so they go back to their chit-chat. Frank doesn't mind their ignorance and starts making up an intercompany letter to Toledo and speaking it out loud. April is out to collect the traveler's check she requested and the steamer reservations. She is elated to have them and rushes back home. Frank is finally getting what he always wanted, so he brags in front of his colleagues that one should do work one actually likes. He stands on the stairs while everybody rushes to get to their homes. He is in no hurry and stands there for some time before leaving. April is sitting on her front porch. As soon as he pulls into the driveway, April comes running to her husband. She had been waiting for him. The children come running too. At night, the entire family sits together, and April shows the kids where they are moving to on the globe. She adds that they will have to take a big boat ride across the sea to get there. Her daughter is afraid she won't know anybody there, but April has an answer to all their innocent questions. She assures her daughter that if she can make friends here on the first day of school, she can also make new friends in Paris. Frank playfully tells his kids that they eat snails and frog legs in Paris, and all burst out laughing. Shep is shining his shoes. His wife, Millie, asks him to change as they are expecting April and Frank to be there soon. She is powdering her face when he asks if she is going to wear the dress she has on, but soon dismisses it with a kiss on her head. Millie looks at her dress one more time in the mirror, now doubtful of her choice of dress, but focuses her attention back on powdering her face. In another room, their 4 kids are watching TV. Shep asks them what they are watching, but none of them responds. Feeling dejected, Shep goes outside to get some fresh air. He stares at the neighboring house. Soon Millie comes out calling him, and on the door stands April, beautiful as ever. Shep's face brightens at April's sight. Millie serves food and makes small talk. April shares that she, Frank, and the kids are going to Paris. Millie is ecstatic, and Shep is surprised, but as soon as April adds that they are going to live there, Millie and Shep are stunned. Frank adds they will leave in September. Millie cannot wrap her head around the idea of them moving, so she asks why they want to move to Paris. Frank answers they always wanted to go to Paris. He asks Shep to tell Millie how beautiful the place is, since he has been there with Frank. Shep agrees that Paris is a great city, all the while looking dumbfounded. Nobody knows what to say, so April takes a long sip of the drink she has, and so does Frank. To dissipate the awkward silence, Millie asks when they decide to go. April answers whimsically that it was about a week ago. Shep wants to know if Frank got a job there. April responds by saying she will be working instead of Frank. Frank will be studying and finally figuring out what he wants to do in life. Shep cannot believe that. For him, man should be the one assuming the role of the provider. Seeing his friends go the unconventional way is making him uncomfortable. April explains that secretarial positions pay well in government agencies over there. This is until Frank figures out what to do, and then he can build a career for himself. And since the living cost is very cheap, they can afford to live there without much problem. April adds that they wanted to do something different. They don't want life just to pass by as they get older. Millie finally raises a toast for her friends, starting a new life in a new place. Shep joins, too, but his face says it all. He is disheartened to see them go, especially April. Later that evening, Millie and Shep are getting ready for bed. Shep discloses that he finds April and Frank's plan of moving very immature. Millie exclaims that she was thinking the same the whole time. Shep mockingly adds what kind of a man sits around in his bathrobe the entire day picking his nose, while his wife goes out and works. While agreeing with Shep, Millie starts crying. Shep rushes to sit beside her, and she leans on his shoulders as she cries her eyes out, saying she is so relieved. Frank and April are in their kitchen, laughing hysterically, remembering Shep and Millie's faces as they told them the news. Frank is thrilled with this change. He shares that this is how he felt going up to the line the first time in the war. The adrenaline rush of doing something is outrageous, as this made him feel alive, full of blood, and more real. The snow on the fields, the trees, and he along with the soldiers walking by. That felt like the truth. April knows that feeling from the first time they got intimate. The next day at the office, all the employees are looking inside their boss Bandy's office. Bart Pollock from Toledo is there, which means a big deal. Frank is called into the office. He makes fun of Frank's reports, calling them humorous and the source of everybody at Toledo's laughter. Back at home, Frank tells April about Pollock. He was perfect presidential material in the worst sense. He had $1 million smile and about 3 pounds of muscle between the ears. Frank then imitates Pollock, and April laughs. She wished she had been there to see his face when Frank told them he was leaving. The Givings have come for lunch. April greets them at the door. Helen, being her chatty self, blames the traffic for being late. Their son John has come too. April and Frank are meeting John for the first time. Helen asks about the children. April apologizes that her children couldn't be there and tells her they have gone to a birthday party. John retorts that if he had a psychiatric patient coming to his home, he too would have gotten the children to some safe place. To alleviate the tension, Helen shifts everybody's attention to the food. She asks April why she went through the trouble of preparing so much food for them. John adds that Helen has been talking nonstop about the Wheelers for months, and how they are a lovely young couple on a revolutionary road. Frank offers some sherry. Helen refuses, but John asks for some and asks for Helen's share too. He then gives a peculiar instruction to serve the sherry in a highball glass with 3 ice cubes, and sherry filled up to the brim. Helen can be seen getting uncomfortable. John asks Frank if he is a lawyer. John's dad, Howard, asks him not to start about the lawyer again. John gets defensive and asks him to concentrate on the egg salad and quit nagging him. Everybody shares uncomfortable glances, as John keeps going on about needing a lawyer for going after his mother with the coffee table. Helen suddenly gets up and asks John to look at the beautiful sight from the window. But John continues unhinged that if she gets hit by the table, that force will be enough to put her in eternal sleep, and will end up being a criminal case. He keeps rambling about hurting his mom while Helen tries to distract him unsuccessfully. Everybody quietens when John suddenly raises his voice asking his mother to shut up. To placate John, Frank promises to recommend a lawyer to him. It works, and John calms down. He develops a liking towards Frank and asks what he does for a living. Frank tells him he works at Knox. He proceeds to say that it is a stupid office job with nothing interesting about it. John keeps asking him questions. Howard interjects and urges John not to ask so many questions, as Frank may not like it. John complies and says he won't ask any more questions because he knows if people want to play house, they got to have a job. And if they're going to play a very nice big house, they got to have a job they don't like. Frank and April laugh at the satire. John apologizes to Frank, but Frank doesn't mind. He agrees with John and explains it to be the reason he quit his job. April adds they are soon moving to Paris. John contemplates this news for some time and then asks Helen if she knew about this, and starts hysterically laughing at the thought of the nice young Wheelers taking off. Helen is embarrassed and asks John to stop it. Seeing things getting out of control, Frank asks John if he would like to get some fresh air. Helen is doubtful, but Frank insists. April, Frank, and John go out on a stroll in the woods. April asks John about him being a mathematician. John says it is all gone after the treatments they gave him in the psychiatric hospital. John is much calmer and hits it off with the Wheelers. John asks them why they are running to Paris. Frank answers they are running from the hopelessness and emptiness of their whole life here. John appreciates their guts to see the hopelessness in their lives and address it. They continue their walk now in much peace. At night, April and Frank are having a conversation over drinks. April points out that John is the first person who seems to know what they are talking about. Frank agrees and says maybe they are as crazy as he is, but they don't care. All that matters is they are taking a new step in their life. As it turns out, Frank had not told his boss he was leaving. Bart has bought Frank out for lunch. Bart is annoyed at Bandy for keeping Frank under a bushel all these years. He has seen Frank's talent and wants him on his team selling electronic computers to American businessmen. It means more money and more time commitment. It is then Frank mentions that he will be leaving the firm in the fall. Bart asks if he is going for a new job. Frank denies. Then Bart asks if it is because of money and assures him that he doesn't have to worry about the money, as there is going to be a raise. But Frank denies that too and says it is for a personal reason he is leaving. Bart persuades him, saying such offers don't come easily, and if he decides to join them, he won't regret his decision. He asks Frank to think about it. Frank is thinking about the offer and working late when Maureen walks in. She asks him about the promotion he will be getting and how his dad must be so proud of him. Frank is surprised to hear about his dad from Maureen. She asks him if she can take him out for drinks to celebrate. He agrees. One day April is all over the place. She even shouts at her daughter for being silly. Frank sees this and asks her what the matter is. Now in tears, she tells him she is pregnant. She had her doubts, but now that she had gone to see a doctor, her suspicions are confirmed. Frank calms her down as she is distressed. She doesn't want another baby. She suggests they take care of it. At the beach with Shep and Millie, Frank tells Shep about the promotion he will be getting, and the raise that accompanies it. Hearing this, April realizes their dream of moving to France is going to remain a dream and nothing more than that. She gets up and walks to the shore. Frank follows her. April is surprised to know Frank hasn't told the officials about moving. He says he will, but he is keeping his options open. And the money they are offering can change their lives for good. They can move into a better place. After all, Parisians aren't the only ones capable of leading interesting lives. Their conversation ends up in an argument, when April asks him if he is okay with being stuck in a job for the rest of his life that he finds ridiculous. Frank doesn't want to fight in front of everybody, so he walks towards the sea for a swim to cool off. Once back home, April and Frank have a huge fight. April is convinced Frank doesn't want to move. Frank wants to, but what is being offered to him at his office is too good to pass. As their fight aggravates, Frank storms off to the bathroom, where he finds a suction device. He is furious at April and shouts at her that even the thought of what she was thinking of doing makes his stomach churn. April bawls. The only reason they came to this place is that she got pregnant, and then they had another child, just so they could tell themselves that their first child was not a mistake. She then asks Frank if he really wants another child. Frank asserts that any sane person knows what April wants is wrong, and she makes it sound like having children is a punishment. April defends herself, saying she loves her children, but Frank doubts that because she just called their daughter a mistake. Frank is doubtful of her intentions. He cannot trust her because, who knows, she must have done this before. Any sane mother would never have bought a rubber tubing to commit the sin she was about to do, only to live out a fantasy. Out of embarrassment, April covers her face with both hands, but still, she cannot hide her guilt. Finally swallowing his rage, Frank suggests April see a shrink. Paris had been only a fantasy they were living to make themselves feel good in their life full of doldrums. Now that it has come crashing down, the cracks in their relationship have visibly deepened. Frank tries to make April believe that they are going to be fine and happy. The past few months have been happy for them, and they can continue living like that if they make an effort. April hopes so too. They finally come to terms with the dissolution of their plans to move to Paris. April tells her children about the change of plans. Frank says yes to Bart's offer, and he goes out with his colleagues to celebrate. Frank and April go out with Millie and Shep for a fun night out. Millie is happy the old gang is back, but April still can get over the fact their plan got cancelled. To cheer her up, Frank asks her for a dance, but she refuses, saying after some time. Millie is more than happy to do it instead. So Frank takes Millie to the dance floor. While dancing, Frank asks Millie if April will be fine. Millie says give her some time, she will come out of her blues. The spinning makes drunk Millie sick, and she has to be shouldered out of the club. In the parking lot, Shep's car gets blocked by other people's cars. April proposes that Frank take Millie back home since she is not well, and she can come with Shep once the people take their cars out of the way. April and Shep sit inside and talk. Shep tries to cheer April up because he knows how much moving to Paris means to her. But secretly, he is glad she is not leaving the town anymore. April confides in him that it didn't have to be Paris. She just wanted them to live again. Frustrated and drunk, April asks Shep to dance with her. One thing leads to another, and April lets her sense of morality get clouded. Shep tells April this is what he always wanted, and he loves her. But April asks him to stop talking and take her home. Apron-clad April is peeling potatoes. Frank comes to talk to her. It has been 12 weeks and he is happy April hasn't done something rash. April is in no mood to talk. But Frank cannot think of a better time than this when they are starting to accept their lives here. He tells her that he has been with another woman a few times. It meant nothing to him, and it is over now. April asks him why he did it. Frank starts explaining that he just wanted to feel like a man again, but that is not what April was asking. So she rephrases it as why did he tell her about his affair? Is it to make her jealous or make her fall in love with him again? Because truth be told, April doesn't feel anything anymore. Frank is taken aback, and he asks if what he does or whom he sleeps with doesn't matter to her. She agrees it doesn't. She further states that she would have cared if she still loved him. But now she doesn't anymore. They are interrupted by Helen, who has come to meet them with Howard and John. At the table, Frank tells them that there has been a change in plans for moving, because April is pregnant. Helen and Howard congratulate her, but John doesn't understand why April being pregnant has anything to do with moving. He asks if people don't have babies in Europe. Frank says they cannot afford to have a baby if they don't have money, but John doesn't buy it. He tries to discern what must have happened that they changed their minds. He looks at April and clearly sees she is an assertive woman and deduces it must have been Frank. John starts getting angry and gets up, yelling at Frank, asking him what happened. Helen tries to appease John, but he is in no mood to listen. John walks up to Frank and narrates all the scenarios that could have happened. He even goes on to say that Frank did it on purpose, so that April is kept hidden behind a maternity dress for the rest of her life. Frank loses his cool. He bangs his fist on the table and asks John to keep his opinion to himself. He goes further to say some very mean things about his mental state. Helen and Howard get up to leave. John gets up too, but before leaving, he talks to April, saying maybe they deserve each other because the way she looks right now, she must give him a very hard time while questioning his manhood. Frank is ready to punch John, but Helen intervenes, pleading John is sick. While leaving, Helen says she is really sorry, but John is not finished yet. He says he is glad he is not the child April is carrying. He leaves soon after saying this. Another brawl starts between Frank and April. April is certain she hates Frank. He was just some boy who made her laugh at a party once, and now she loathes the sight of him. The whole episode has pushed April to the brink of insanity. She warns Frank if he touches her, she'll scream, and she is not lying. After she stops screaming her lungs out, Frank loses it and starts throwing furniture all over the house. He storms off to his room, crying, angry, and foaming with rage. He hears the front door open, so he rushes downstairs to find April gone. He sees her running into the nearby woods and runs after her. She is fed up with Frank talking all the time, and she needs some quiet time to think. She warns if he doesn't leave her alone, she'll scream again. Frank leaves her alone and goes back home. Frank sits and drinks in the house in the dark while April cries in the woods. In the morning, Frank is exhausted from last night's drama. He finds April cooking breakfast for him. Pinned up hair and a sweet smile are unexpected of her after last night's episode. Frank stares at her, trying to grasp the change. She eats with Frank and says since it is an important day for him with his first conference with Bart, she thought of making a nice breakfast. She asks what he will be doing in his new job since he hasn't been that chatty about it. He draws a computer on the napkin to show April what his new job entails. She looks at him while he scribbles some lines. After looking at the drawing, she suggests Frank to value what he does, because he is obviously good at it. They share a smile before Frank gets up to leave for the office. He tells her it was one of the best breakfasts he has had in a while. April thanked him because she enjoyed it too. At the door, Frank turns and asks if April hates him. April says she doesn't and comes closer to fix his tie. She kisses him before sending him off. She looks at him, leaving while she holds her tears back. Once he leaves, April goes back inside and cries her heart out. She then calls Millie to ask if she can babysit her children for the evening, since she is not feeling well. She also asks her to tell them that their mommy loves them. April then prepares to perform a procedure on herself that will later prove incurable. After she is done, she climbs down the stairs slowly. She looks ghostly pale and weak. She reaches the window and smiles as she sees everything so bright and lively, but suddenly starts to feel uneasy. She looks down and finds she is bleeding. Panic strikes her, and she manages to reach the phone to call an ambulance. Millie is folding clothes when she sees an ambulance going toward April's house. Frank is in the hospital. Shep comes, and Frank tells him the absurdity of the case. The doctors say the fetus was already out when she got here, and they are operating on her now to get out the placenta. She had lost a lot of blood before the ambulance came and is still bleeding. Frank cannot bring himself to say anything anymore and breaks down. He knows she did it. Shep looks at Frank, horrified, and excuses himself to get some coffee. When he returns, he doesn't find Frank sitting where he left him. Instead, he comes out of the other room with a ghastly expression on his face. April succumbs to the inflictions on herself. Frank runs down the road. He runs to forget his pain, to forget he lost his dear wife when things finally seem to be getting better. He runs and runs, hoping to get away from this agony. In the present, Shep is pouring drinks for himself and Millie. Millie recounts the Wheelers were a good couple, but after April passed away, Frank shifted to the city with his children. They have the new owners of the house that once belonged to April and Frank over. Shep has turned into a quiet man since he too had feelings for April. Shep cannot listen about them anymore, so he walks out of the house. Millie excuses herself and follows him. She finds him standing outside in their backyard. Millie asks him if he is all right. He tells her he doesn't want to talk about the Wheelers anymore. She agrees and hugs him. Frank is now a devoted father. His kids are everything to him. At times he would sit alone in the park and think if things could have turned out to be different. But it doesn't matter anymore. So he focuses on his children, giving them all the love he can. Helen sits in her cozy drawing room, petting her pooch. She tells Howard how nice she feels seeing the house at the Revolutionary Road all perked and cleaned up. She has loved that house for years, and thinks the new owners are the only really suitable people she has ever found for it. Except for the Wheelers, Howard adds. Helen admits she was very fond of the Wheelers, but they were a bit whimsical for her taste. The main reason the little house was so hard to sell was because they let it depreciate so dreadfully. As she begins to recount what all the Wheelers did, Howard turns down the volume of his hearing aid till he cannot listen to her anymore. He stares at her blankly. Sometimes people hate the people they are supposed to love, but the way one handles it makes or breaks the relationship.